On June 19th, 1944, beneath the waters of the Philippine Sea, the crew of USS Cavalla prepared for the shot of a lifetime. At 11:52 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler raised his periscope for a final bearing check. Through the lens, he saw the silhouette of the Japanese aircraft carrier Shōkaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, now steaming at high speed with her flight deck empty after launching aircraft. In just minutes, she would be gone, taking with her not just steel and sailors, but the heart of Japan's carrier strike force. This moment wasn't a matter of chance. It was a result of planning, code-breaking, and positioning. The Japanese had just launched Operation Ego, a high-stakes plan designed to halt the American advance across the Pacific and deliver a decisive blow that might reverse their fortunes. But they underestimated American intelligence. At Pearl Harbor, codebreakers had already decrypted Japanese communications and correctly predicted the timing and direction of their fleet movements. In response, the U.S. Navy set a line of submarines across the Philippine Sea, like a tripwire. Cavalla was one of those submarines. On her first war patrol, no less, assigned to hunt the most valuable targets in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Shōkaku wasn't just another warship. She had been built as a symbol of Japanese naval dominance, a modern, fast fleet carrier meant to challenge America's quantitative superiority with training, coordination, and elite tactics. But by mid-1944, Japan's doctrine was collapsing under the weight of attrition. Years of brutal combat had bled their veteran pilots dry. Fuel shortages, caused largely by successful U.S. submarine attacks on Japanese oil convoys, had forced cutbacks in training flights. Aircraft could still be built, but there were no longer skilled crews to fly them. The gap between vision and reality had become unbridgeable. As Cavalla crept into position, her crew worked with precision. Using the torpedo data computer, they calculated the firing solution. 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were readied, each now equipped with improved contact detonators after earlier failures in the war. At a range of just 1,400 yards, dangerously close for a submarine facing a well-defended carrier group, Kostler gave the order to fire. One by one, 6 torpedoes sped through the depths. 3 struck home with devastating accuracy, 1 forward, 1 amidships, 1 aft. Flames erupted. Fuel lines burst. The hangar decks became infernos. Within 10 minutes, Shōkaku was mortally wounded and slipping beneath the waves. The attack was not without consequence. Japanese destroyers responded with fury, launching a brutal counterattack. Over 100 depth charges were dropped into the sea as Cavalla dove deep and ran silent. The pressure hull groaned, and tension gripped every man aboard. But Cavalla survived. The submarine sustained only minor damage, and hours later, she slipped away from the area. When her crew surfaced and transmitted the news, the message was short and clear. 1 carrier sunk. Mission complete. The significance of the day didn't stop there. That same afternoon, the USS Albacore managed to sink Taiho, the brand-new flagship of the Japanese carrier fleet. In one day, 2 of Japan's most powerful fleet carriers were sunk, not by carrier-launched airstrikes, but by submarines. These attacks occurred before the decisive air battle even began, robbing Japan of crucial deck space and experienced personnel at the very moment they needed them most. When Japan's remaining carriers launched wave after wave of aircraft during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, they were met with devastating American resistance. Radar-directed F-6F Hellcats intercepted incoming formations at long range. The U.S. Navy's use of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, combined with superior pilot training and numerical superiority, resulted in catastrophic losses for the Japanese. In just 2 days, hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Many never even found their targets. Others were picked off long before reaching American ships. American aviators referred to it grimly as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan's pre-war doctrine had centered around the idea of a decisive fleet engagement, a singular battle where skill and strategy would overcome numerical disadvantage. But that vision was no longer viable in 1944. Without experienced pilots or enough fuel to train new ones, Japan's carriers had become hollow threats. The flight decks remained, but the men and machines needed to make them deadly were gone. The carrier was no longer the spearhead of Japan's naval might. It was becoming a liability. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the effective end of Japan's ability to wage carrier warfare. Even had Shōkaku survived her encounter with Cavalla, she would have had little offensive value without trained pilots and effective strike groups. From that moment on, Japan's carriers would serve a different role, not as weapons of war, but as bait. At Leyte Gulf just a few months later, carriers were used deliberately to lure the American fleet away from the actual point of attack, because they could no longer function in their original role. Their era had ended. Yet Cavalla's victory was more than just the sinking of a ship. It was a culmination of a transformation in submarine warfare. At the start of the war, the American submarine force had been plagued by technical failures, timid leadership, and doctrinal confusion. Torpedoes didn't explode. Command were cautious. Submarines were treated as scouts or commerce raiders, not fleet killers. But by 1944, that had changed. Improved torpedoes, hardened tactics, and battle-hardened crews had turned the U.S. submarine force into a lethal strategic tool, capable of severing supply lines, annihilating convoys, and sinking capital ships. Cavalla had proven that decisively. For the Japanese Navy, the loss of Shōkaku was deeply symbolic. She had survived the opening blows of the war. She had carried aircraft over Pearl Harbor and fought in every major carrier battle since. Her destruction, not by rival aircraft but by an unseen submarine, was a death knell, not just for a ship, but for a doctrine of fleet and an entire naval vision. She did not go down in a grand duel of carriers and aircraft, but in a silent ambush beneath the sea. In the aftermath of the battle, Japan's naval leadership faced a grim reality. Their cherished carriers, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been reduced to little more than floating symbols. Stripped of their air groups, their trained pilots, and their strategic value, the loss of Shōkaku and Taiho wasn't merely the removal of ships from the order of battle. It was a collapse of a decades-long naval doctrine built on the concept of the decisive fleet engagement, a doctrine now rendered obsolete by the new tools of modern war: radar, code-breaking, industrial might, and submarines lurking where they couldn't be seen. American commanders, meanwhile, had taken note. The success of Cavalla, Albacore, and other submarines during the battle proved that undersea warfare had reached full maturity. Submarines were no longer simply commerce raiders or scouting tools. They had become capital ship killers, capable of changing the outcome of major fleet actions. Their ability to strike without warning and vanish into the depths gave them a psychological edge as well as a tactical one. For Japanese sailors, the sea itself had turned hostile. The very waters they sailed in could now erupt with sudden death at any moment. The legacy of that day in June extended far beyond the war itself. In the post-war era, submarine warfare would become one of the cornerstones of naval power, eventually evolving into platforms for ballistic missiles, stealth operations, and global deterrence. But it began here in the Philippine Sea, with a spread of torpedoes and a crew on their first war patrol. Cavalla's victory was not only a tactical success, it was a vision of the future, silent, deadly, and unseen until it was too late. Today, Shōkaku rests at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, a silent tomb to an extinguished dream. Cavalla, preserved as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas, remains above the waves, a quiet monument to the silent service. Her strike was not only one of the most effective submarine attacks of the war, but a turning point in naval history. In just 7 minutes, She ended the career of a carrier and helped accelerate the collapse of Japan's ability to fight at sea. The war did not end that day, but the nature of the fight had changed forever, and the men of Cavalla, in a single daring act of precision and nerve, helped usher in that change. Their report was brief: 1 carrier sunk, mission complete. But the truth was far more profound. They had helped bury a